You are about to watch part two of Popcorn's review of the year. For part one, please return to our YouTube channel and click the previous video. Moving on to May, we had the local elections, of course, and took a shellacking, and some mayoral elections as well, in which only Ben Houchin survived up in Tees Valley. Impressive result given the prevailing circumstances. He's turned that into a really impressive area for the Conservative Party, and holding on in bleak electoral circumstances is impressive, truly impressive. Andy Street lost, of course, in Birmingham narrowly. Sadiq Khan quite comfortably re-elected when it all came down to it. I think it's 44% to 33% over Susan Hall. And hundreds of Tory seats lost in the local elections. In chewing through the numbers of these results, and in proof that we should probably therefore make maths compulsory to the age of 40, Rishi Sunak decides this gives him the mathematical basis to call a snap general election, which he announces on May the 22nd, to the shock, surprise of absolutely everybody, apart from a handful of loyal confidants who quickly dashed down to Ladbrokes to put their money on such a surprising eventuality occurring. I still not have read a definitive explanation of why the election would be called so early, given the absolutely parlous state of the Conservatives in the polls. I'm not suggesting if it was delayed another 3 or 4 months that the result would have been meaningfully different, but you at least have the chance that something turns up, that you sort of cling on for dear life. And, I don't know, perhaps Keir Starmer runs into some scandal or difficulty. You can't engineer it, but it might just happen. You play for time if you're miles behind. Sam, have you got any idea why July the 4th was suddenly the chosen date? I think it was Dan Hannan, Lord Hannan, who said that, he called this surprised election, but the only people he caught off guard were the Conservative Party. Everybody else seemed ready for it.
Yes, I was watching, not wanting to plug it, but the At Home with the Rees-Moggs recently,
Oh,
and the
plug it!
first
It's great. It's great. Yeah.
it is actually it's a very funny and endearing show. Anyway, watching that just brought back to me almost like a PTSD, the utter madness of the calling of the election, standing there in the rain. I mean,
I
why
mean,
would
we
you?
can't blame him for the meteorological circumstances, especially, can we?
I mean, I'm not wanting to go back. You can blame him for going and standing in it,
Right?
which
Yeah, fair,
I
fair.
suppose I suppose in a way you could, yeah, I suppose in a way sums up his leadership of the Conservative Party. You can't blame him for what he found, but you can blame him for what he did once he found it.
Yeah,
But I mean, why that date? I mean, there are theories, but none of them have been confirmed. I mean, there's a theory that they were getting close to the point that that would trigger another leadership race, and he went early in order to avoid that.
Graham Brady scotched that one though. Brady said I think he only had about 10 letters or something.
True. Well, I mean, true, but that's a theory anyway. That and you never know whether or not there were a lot that he'd heard that there were a lot of people planning to put letters in, even if they hadn't already done so. I mean, I thought Brady's words were well chosen, perhaps, but the so there's that one. I mean, uh, to me, I think at the end of the day, it's too clever by half, which again sums up Sunakism in a way, that the idea we'll catch him on the hop, we'll get in, we'll get in and surprise them before Labour's properly set to go. An election will sort of bring the troops back together rather than a few more months of drift. But I, all the months later, I still can't come up with a good reason why you would do it then. I just can't. I'm sorry. I just can't think of a good
Andrew,
reason.
Andrew, any theories at all? This is quite a major decision, and it does seem odd to say, "Oh, we're at 23% in the opinion polls. I want to bank that." I mean, I'll definitely take the money rather than open the box. I mean, bizarre. I can't get my head around it.
Oh, sheer lunacy, really, wasn't it? Because as we discussed the Rwanda scheme earlier, I mentioned that if he waited a little bit longer, perhaps more of a deterrent effect would have occurred. Perhaps
or
some
the
flights
courts would have blocked it, and that of itself would have been
yes,
a political discussion, you know.
It would have been a political discussion, but then Rishi Sunak could have said, well, look, the courts have blocked it, the opposition's blocked it as much as it possibly can, as long as that actually wants to do something about it. And of course, if he had held the election in November, which we were all expecting, Nigel Farage probably would have been well and truly on the campaign trail in the United States and wouldn't have come back as the leader of reform and wouldn't have been elected as a member of parliament. So in that respect, it was a strategic mistake. I mean, the economy could have been looking better than it did back in May when he called the election. There were all sorts of reasons why he should have held on. It didn't seem to make any sense whatsoever. I mean, perhaps he just thought the writing was on the wall and the 4th of July is Independence Day in America, and therefore I want my independence and I wouldn't mind going off on holiday to America. I don't know. There is really no rhyme or reason to it.
Yeah, that was one theory, wasn't it? That, I mean, look, we're beating up on Rishi pretty hard, and I should note that, you know, I've always had a massive soft spot for him, largely based around the fact that he's a devout supporter of Southampton Football Club. But the man has other merits as well, it's worth saying. But there was a sort of theory that he got a great job in California, but he hasn't departed as we speak. He's still the MP for Richmond. Annunziata, any theories? Because I'm still scratching my head on this one.
Absolutely no idea. It was the wrong decision at the wrong time. I was 18 in 1997, and in the same sort of situation where he knew he was going to lose and the question was by how much, John Major hung on. Thank goodness. It gave me my first vote. If he'd gone early,
was that the reason? Was that the reason?
I would not have been able to vote because I would have been too young.
How did that weigh heavily with John Major at the time?
My vote was all important, obviously. But it was the thing that you do. If you're miles behind, you take every opportunity to turn things around that you've got, and
you just hope something turns up.
And in fact, as it turns out, it did. That Labour have been taking advantage of the figures, the economic figures that have come out post-election, as things did start to tick up. They're now ticking down again, or heading down again, because Labour have got all the wrong policies. But Rishi Sunak, whilst I think he was not a Conservative, and he was obviously not chosen by the membership in any kind of democratic way, he was imposed on us by the parliamentary party, of whom I have less trust than I would like. He was doing the right things on the economy. Whilst his tax regime with Jeremy Hunt was appalling, he was at least actually targeting growth rather than Labour, who say it and are doing absolutely everything to kill it. And without jumping ahead, I think if he had had those extra 6 months, some of that would have come into public sight. Instead of which, everything was going down. Everything was bad. He picked the most perfect moment to do as badly as possible. And in fact, in opposition, if we'd had another 20 MPs, it would have made a difference. It would have limited how much damage Labour can do. And it might not have been 20, it might have been an extra 80. And then you've got actual weight behind you in every vote that comes through, because Labour is incredibly divided, incredibly split, and the rebellion votes could have made a difference. Instead of which, for reasons that are completely incomprehensible, I think, to everyone except Rishi in this country, and as you say, those a few stupid people in his inner circle who took bets on the date. He went early for no benefit to anyone. Yeah,
bizarre. We all remain somewhat perplexed then. Then obviously across May and June, we get the general election campaign itself and, you know, people considering how to vote. In my view, actually, an absolutely terrible vote that we got in June was on the 6th of June, when the Premier League voted by 19 votes to 1 in favour of keeping the video assistant referee. Congratulations to Wolverhampton Wanderers. I believe they were the one who defied the majority. But there was obviously a wider election going on beyond the important issue of VAR in association football. What memories do people have of the election campaign? I was trying to refresh my memory of what actually happened. I mean, of course, on D-Day, Sunak returns from France early, a misstep. So it's sort of, I sort of hate it when these presentational things become the dominant part of an election, because I think what you're going to do on tax and spend or whatever, should weigh more heavily. But that was a catastrophic misstep. Farage has obviously entered the race now. And again, the timing, one might have thought, Andrew, you were saying, was, enabled him to do that. Whereas if it had clashed more or less with the US presidential election, perhaps he wouldn't have thrown his hat in the ring. So the election campaign itself would have been very different, and perhaps the party political and electoral situation we have at the moment would be different as a consequence. What do you remember anything of the election campaign, Andrew? D-Day, Farage enters the race. I mean, I actually thought in some ways the only interesting story was Reform UK.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to mention the D-Day thing when you started to ask the questions. So yeah, Farage entering the race belatedly as well. He was sort of pushed into it a little bit, wasn't he? Because initially he said that he wasn't going to seek a seat, and then he was pushed into it. No, I can't really remember much else. I think I was just sort of hiding behind the sofa most of the time and just hoping that the thing would end. I knew eventually it would have to. And then we got to July. I always felt that the result of the election was baked in, probably a good year before it was held. But as Annunziata has touched upon, it was really how catastrophic would that defeat be? And it could have been a much better defeat if you can possibly have, well, you can have one. It could have been much better for the Conservative Party. So I can't really remember much at all about it other than those things, Mark.
Sam, I'll give you a nudge as well. On the 13th of June, Keir Starmer unveiled the Labour Party's general election manifesto, saying that wealth creation is the, quote, #1 priority, and Labour will focus on economic growth. That didn't age particularly well. The next day, on the 14th of June, there was actually an opinion poll showing Reform ahead of the Conservative Party for the first time. What are your memories of it? Or were you, like Andrew, hiding behind the sofa?
Probably my biggest memory is across the whole campaign is weird Tory optimism, I suppose. There seemed to be a huge amount of disconnect between what people were talking about they felt on the doorstep and what the opinion poll says. And I don't know if everybody else on this agrees with me, but I was on a lot of campaign WhatsApp groups, and so many of them, they were saying, "Oh, we're getting such good feedback on the doorstep. It's looking like we might beat the swing here." And I don't think there was a single one where they actually did. And
well, there must have been a seat where we beat the swing. Hang on a second.
Well, sorry, seat that of the WhatsApp group when I was on the WhatsApp group. Right. So obviously I'm sure there are seats we beat the swing, but I wasn't party to what the people were saying in that seat. And it was very. I think. I mean, I wasn't in this country in 1997, but it feels like it was a similar situation to that. When people engaged with the Conservatives, they actually got quite good feedback, but there was just this huge silent majority of people who were absolutely not engaging with the Conservatives and also in no way willing to vote. Probably, I mean, we've already touched on it a few times, but the biggest memory for me is probably the betting scandal. I think that was probably the one that really, although D-Day was horrific, I think the betting scandal just played into the, you could sort of explain away D-Day a little bit once the initial anger got dissipated a little bit for people. But I think the betting scandal played so much into the, Tories out for themselves, trying to enrich their buddies and destroy, at the expense of the country type thing. I think that played into it so much, played into the stereotype so much that it hurt the party a lot more. But that's just my view.
Yeah, and Annunziata, what was your take? Again, the betting scandal, I think, again, it was all optics, right? It's not at all clear to me that anybody broke the law. It just looked terrible. But the principal aim of being a senior Conservative politician, it suggested, was to line your own pockets rather than to engage in public service. What were the standout moments for you, Annunziata? I say standout moments because I can't think of any highlights.
There were no highlights. It was depressing from beginning to end. That I was hearing, as Sam was, from WhatsApp groups, glimmers of optimism, and I think every Conservative in the country was clinging to those tiny nuggets where you'd knocked on one door and someone had said, "I'm going to support the Conservatives, come whatever." But overall, everything was bad. The campaign was bad. The errors were bad. The emails that Conservative members were getting from central office were so shockingly bad.
What was bad about them?
Some of them were, most of them were from people we had never heard of. It would be, I don't know, Lord Bloggins is asking you to donate money. They were consistently asking for money. It was clear they were bust, and there are ways to ask for money and there are ways not to. The ways not to are to tell me that we've got to give £10 each. If just 10 people in Skegness donate, Boston and Skegness, my constituency, donate £10, we will be able to run a campaign on social media.
Richard Tice must have been terrified.
He must have been quaking in his boot. But we're Conservatives, and we then spoke to other Conservatives, and funnily enough, in the two cities of London, Westminster, they were having exactly the same email, except for it might have been 12 for members. It was absolutely ridiculous. And none of their electioneering won. A single vote. If anything, it lost them. The not going to D-Day. Fine.
Well, he went just to, I'm going to stand up for my fellow Saints fan here. He did go.
Yes.
He just left early. I do that a lot at Southampton matches when we're 5-0 down.
Leaving early and not being there with the world leaders on the last day was a massive mistake. That there are veterans up and down this country to whom that really, really did matter, to whom that still matters, and they didn't feel respected or seen. The gambling, it was just a litany of errors. Missteps would be a nice way to put it.
Yeah. I mean, my favourite canvassing experience, and I wonder whether I'm always sceptical about optimism in electoral politics. I've always had a theory that if you go to any parliamentary seat in any circumstances and ask the candidate of each and every political party what share of the vote do they actually think they're going to get, and you add them all up, it would come to at least 200% of the vote, right? Because you've just people just overestimate there. But generally speaking, so far as it could be identified, I was, and the people I was canvassing with, were only knocking on doors of people who had said that they had definitely voted Conservative in 2019. So you're already only focusing on a cohort that's likely to be disproportionately supportive. And I can remember knocking on one door in a seat. I won't name the seat, it's unfair, but a seat we did actually end up holding. And I was actually thinking, knocking on all these doors who were on the canvas returns with C next to them for Conservative, it was pretty good. We seem to be holding on to most of our vote, no better than that, and therefore we'll probably hold on to the seat. And I was knocking on the door, coming back and giving to the chat with the clipboard, well, it's a laptop or a mobile phone now, the information saying, Mr. Wilkins is still on side. Oh, that's great. And then I knocked on another door, and the other chap came back. He said, "Oh yes, Mr. and Mrs. Smith at number 9, they're still going to vote for us." And he said, "Well, that's great." And then I said, "Well, actually, Mr. and Mrs. Bloggs at number 13 are actually members of the Conservative Party." To which the guy with the clipboard said, "Okay, well, I'll put them down as reform voters then." Anyway, we get to the result on July the 4th, where we gathered together in London to watch the unfolding apocalypse. I mean, this has been much discussed since, but I'm going to ask each of you whether the numbers landed about where you were expecting, there or thereabouts. I'd been out getting some sun in Mallorca just before polling day. Got back on polling day. But a former political journalist has said to me, "I think the Tories will win 120 seats." I wish I'd put some money on that prediction in somewhere around that band. Sam, as the results came out, what you were expecting?
Goes to show how awful the campaign was, that it was almost what I was hoping for. My worry was that I thought on balance somewhere between 110 and 140 was probably going to was sort of the likely range. But my real fear, as we counted down to the exit poll, was that the Conservatives would come third behind the Liberal Democrats, and I thought that was a real possibility. It was about right, and frankly, probably about what the Conservative Party deserved, if I'm perfectly honest. I mean, they ran a terrible campaign, and after 14 years of pretty average government, I can't say I was surprised that the party was pretty resoundingly defeated. I was surprised in some of the specific results. There were certain seats that there were some seats that were a surprise that we lost. I mean, I was honestly surprised to see, for example, Ranald Jayawardena go down in his seat in Hampshire. But there were some seats that we held that I was actually, I think it's Bob Blackman and Harrow.
Bob Blackman was the only Tory who had a good July. Not only did he hold on to Harrow, there was a swing from Labour to Conservative.
I know. It's extraordinary.
And then a few days later, he becomes chairman of the 1922 committee. I mean, I'll have whatever he's drinking. Blimey.
Ian Duncan Smith was a
that was the highlight of the night, yeah. Right? That was absolutely, yes. That was a burst of sheer joy in an otherwise miserable night. Andrew, was it about where you were at? Or, I mean, because one of the odd things we're just reflecting on, there might have been a bit of Conservative over-optimism on the feeling on the doorstep is much more positive. But then anecdotes on the night itself was that sort of many Conservatives were sort of breathing a sigh of relief once they saw the exit poll that we were going to, I think the exit poll slightly overstated the Conservative performance in seat terms, but that we were going to win, 120, 130 seats in that range. There was a sort of few, it could have been worse. I mean, blimey, that shows how badly the party had fallen.
I think I said it would be between 120 and 130 ahead of it. That was my prediction, so I got that right. A little bit like Sam, though. I think it was more through optimism than anything else. I was hoping we could get that many, and I think many Conservatives breathed a sigh of relief when it was that many, because it could have been a heck of a lot worse. But that's where we were. I mean, we're talking about the campaign. I mean, I remember a couple of weeks before the campaign ended, for the general election, I was invited to go along to Leeds to some sort of Conservative Party event. Rishi Sunak is speaking there, so I decided to make the trip across. It may still be in Yorkshire, but it's from one riding to another, so it took me about an hour and a half to get there. I turned up at CCHQ in Leeds. We're in this small room without any ventilation whatsoever, some cameras there. Rishi Sunak gave a speech literally 3 or 4 minutes long, and then that was it. And that was his idea of rallying the troops. But I did meet him. It's the only time I've ever met Rishi Sunak. I was about to go into the gents, and there was this guy with an earpiece in outside. I thought, oh, he's security. So Rishi Sunak opened the door, came out of the gents. I said hello to him. He said hello back to me, and I went into the gents. And that was my one and only meeting with Rishi Sunak.
Right.
And I think it rather sums it up. A little bit of toilet humour, if I may say it so.
Yeah.
But it rather sums up the campaign, and that particular event rather summed up the campaign. It was so lackluster. So 121 seats. Well, thank God we got 121 seats. But but if we got an extra 80, we would have been in such a better position, and we could have done. I think if we'd gone later.
And Annunziata, I mean, it's a historically awful result. On the other hand, only a notch or two away from being replaced by the Liberal Democrats as the official opposition, right? I mean, I haven't done the maths, but had the Lib Dems maybe got 1% or 2% more of the national vote and the Conservatives 1% or 2% less, you could imagine ending up with, I don't know, 96 Lib Dems and 95 Conservatives, nearly lost the role of the opposition. Where were you at? About as bleak as you were expecting?
Well, I was actually really enjoying the evening because I was with PopCon.
Yeah.
And we were relentless.
That always brings sunshine to the darkest night.
It absolutely does. And I sat with all of you as my brother got thoroughly kicked out of Northeast Somerset and Hanham. And my highlight absolutely was, as Sam said, Ian Duncan Smith.
Mm-hmm.
That it was Labour splitting their vote that won Ian Duncan Smith. It was not the Conservatives.
That's right. The Labour candidate had been deselected, ran as an independent, and the independent Labour and Labour candidate got almost exactly the same number of votes each. So Ian was able to come through the middle, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And when you're relying on winning seats by your opposition, I think the only seat we gained was in Leicester for exactly the same reason, that there were the 2 Labour candidates, because the Labour Party had fallen out with each other. And when you're relying on your opposition dividing themselves to win, you're not winning hearts and minds. You're not actually winning the battle. And I think that's the lesson we all have to take from this, is that if the right does the same thing, we let through socialism again and again and again. And that, I think, is the real problem with reform, that and I was talking to a very senior Labour advisor earlier this week, where Labour and the Lib Dems have for decades had a below the radar non-aggression pact, so that Labour fight hard in seats they're more likely to win. The Lib Dems fight hard in seats they're more likely to win.
Yeah. Well, maybe, and I might even go so far as say, hopefully, the centre right of British politics learns from that lesson. Especially now we got the data to base it on, right? We know which seats Reform have, a decent crack of winning, and we know which seats the Conservatives have a decent crack of winning next time. Thank you for watching part 2 of PopCon's review of the year. The remaining 2 parts will be released in the coming days, so keep an eye on our socials for updates.